Well, the headline news today is two of the Coutts Three protesters who have been on trial for weeks have been sentenced. Marco van Hugenbos, regarded as the leader of the protest, has received a sentence of 120 days to be served in jail. He was led out of the courtroom directly to jail. In the end, he'll probably serve 4 or 5 weeks in jail, but still a custodial sentence. Whereas the second protester who was sentenced today, his name is George Jansen, he was sentenced to 90 days, but to be served in the community. Not even house arrest. He's not subject to house arrest. He's not subject to a curfew. He's subject to a number of conditions to keep the peace, be of good behavior, report into authorities if he leaves the jurisdiction, things like that. But basically, he's allowed to go. And the difference, I put it to you, between these two men receiving quite different sentences is that Marco van Hugenbos did not participate in a process of remorse, which the system permits. He did not allow a court officer to do a pre-sentence report where he would interview people in Marco van Hugenbos' family and church and community to get evidence to show the judge that he was a good guy and that jailing him would not be of use to the public. And whereas George Jansen did that, and I think the judge was touched by the fact that George has such a large family and he's responsible for so many people and he goes to church, and I think the fact that that information came forward was helpful to George. But more importantly than that, yesterday the judge asked both men if they had any statement before the sentencing was read out, and George Jansen gave a very interesting statement, which I understand was written completely by himself, namely that he regrets the inconvenience and harm that was done to his neighbors, but he does not reject or disavow his own political views. It was a very carefully threaded needle, and I think it did the job. And I think he looked sympathetic and human. He looked remorseful, but not someone who would abandon his principles. And there was a moment where the prosecutor jumped up and wanted a curfew on George Jansen, and the judge pushed back very sharply and very quickly and said, no, George Jansen needs to be able to go into the community, work as a realtor, etc. So what a difference showing some submission to this system makes. Now, you may think that I'm advocating submissiveness towards the state. Not quite. But my point is, if the men were found guilty by a jury of their peers, which they were, if that's not the dispute anymore, if that is a matter of law, and if they have not appealed that, then they are guilty if they've been found guilty, especially given that it was a jury that found them guilty. It was their neighbors who found them guilty. It was not some Ottawa-appointed judge. So if they are guilty, do they accept that they are guilty and express any sort of remorse at all? If the front line for these protesters is still saying that they did nothing wrong, then that's a battle to be had appealing their conviction. But if they are indeed convicted, then the question is, what's the best thing to do under the sentence? So it's very interesting, and I say that because there's one more man who is yet to be sentenced. It's called the Coutts Three. And that third man, Alex Van Herk, fired his lawyer a couple days ago and asked the judge for a few months to get his act together. The judge said, okay. Now Alex Van Herk, the third man, knows the contours of the mind of the judge, knows what the range, what the spectrum of outcomes is. And so basically it comes down to this, in my view. If Alex Van Herk says, look, Your Honor, I have my passionate beliefs, but I'm sorry I inconvenienced my neighbors and the community, I think he too may get house arrest or a conditional sentence like George Jansen. But if he declares war on the system and goes down fighting, well, he may be sent to jail too. It's an interesting conundrum. It's one of the things about civil disobedience is when you break the law knowingly, are you willing to pay the price? And how far are you willing to go? Rebel News knows a lot of people like this. I refer, for example, to my friend Tommy Robinson in the United Kingdom, who was told by a judge, take down that video from Twitter, and if you don't, off to jail. And he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He'll be out in 9, hopefully, but he's serving it in solitary confinement. The law is not designed for people with such strong principles that they are no longer responsive to the normal incentives. Most people if told, you will have a conviction, you will have a sentence, you will go to jail. Most people are terrified by that and embarrassed by that and want to do whatever they can to avoid that, either winning the trial and not being guilty or appealing a guilty conviction, or trying to find some mitigating way to get the sentence down. It's very interesting. I was there in court in the United Kingdom when the judge basically said to Tommy, take that tweet down today and I'll lock 3 months off your sentence, and Tommy refused. It's fascinating to see how stubborn men react to our justice system, but I'm reminded of George Bernard Shaw, who said, reasonable people conform to the world. Unreasonable people make the world conform to them. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable people. And I wouldn't want everyone in the world to be unreasonable. That would be a tough place to live. But I think we do need very principled people amongst us. The trick, I suppose, is to be thoughtful and strategic, and to be stubborn in the right time and the right place to have maximum effect. We'll see what Alex Van Herk chooses when he's before this same judge in a couple months, but today was very interesting to me, and I'd like to thank all the Rebel viewers who have chipped in to support all three of the men. Marco van Hugenbos and Alex Van Herk had Democracy Fund lawyers at the beginning of the trial, and for various reasons they moved to other lawyers. George Jansen had Democracy Fund lawyers to the end. So thank you to all the Democracy Fund donors, the Rebel News donors, who made that possible. A family member of mine said, these people knew they were breaking the law, isn't that vigilantism? And I said, look, if a terrorist murderer named Omar Khadr gets a lawyer, well, for darn sure these peaceful protesters at Coutts deserve a lawyer too. And I think there is two-tier justice in this world. If you look at the treatment of the Hamas protesters, who go much further than protesting, who utter death threats, commit vandalism, trespass, and do some terrible things, they are generally not touched by police. I think that it's necessary for a country to have the rule of law where everyone is treated the same. I think, in fairness, George Jansen was given the sentence that environmental protesters typically do if they show remorse. And I think Marco van Hugenbos was actually given a sentence that people on the left typically do if they show his lack of remorse. So I would say, and I did not expect to say this, I would say that this court case by Justice Keith Yamauchi was fair. And I think the judge was good. And I sat and I listened to him for many days over the course of time. I think he was interested, engaged, even-handed. And I think that he did the community a service. I believe that those trucker protesters are the reason why Canada broke out of its totalitarian descent. I have to be careful that I don't endorse vigilantism, and I don't. You know me, I work through journalism and activism and the courts. I don't engage in violence or the threat of violence myself. It's a choice I make, and it's the whole purpose of Rebel News. But at the very least, I think it was the right thing for us to tell the story of these truckers and to crowdfund the lawyers. And there's a lot to think about here, and I look forward to rereading the ruling by Keith Yamauchi. I do, though, think that perhaps justice was served. For Rebel News, I'm Ezra Levant.